our topic today, I was surprised that as recently as like 2017, there was a study that said half of American Christians believe this.
Yeah.
I was shocked about this.
It's the most known Bible verse that's not in the Bible. Hey everyone, welcome back to Rough Cut Faith. It's nice to have you joining us today.
Yes.
We are super excited to continue to tell you what's not in the Bible. It's something that...
Don't laugh at the microphone, Scott.
Yeah, I think it's been fun to talk about things that debunk a little bit of myths.
Nice. It's funny because sometimes when you sit down to do a little bit of the prep for these conversations, sometimes our topic today, I was surprised that as recently as like 2017, there was a study that said half of American Christians believe this.
Yeah.
I was shocked about this.
It's the most known Bible verse that's not in the Bible.
That is probably the thing that makes me more surprised. When I was like, because we picked the topics and then we're like, let's see.
Yeah.
And I'm like, we should talk, maybe. But you're kind of sitting there going, is this actually going to be worthwhile?
Is this the one that...
Can we actually have a decent conversation about this? And then all of a sudden it's like, over half of American Christians believed this in a 2017 Barna Research survey. I was like, wait, what?
Mm-hmm.
So
and the cryptic verse that we're talking about, which doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist.
Is God helps those who help themselves. That is, the origins of it are kind of, you can see them in Aesop's fables.
Yep.
You can see they're early in Greek. Some Greek proverbs have this concept about God helping people who help themselves. But it was
Ben Franklin wrote it.
Yeah, it was really made popular in American lore in the 1700s when Ben Franklin had it in his Farmer's Almanac.
Poor Richard's Almanac.
Poor Richard's.
Yep.
Poor Richard's Almanac. There was somebody in the late 1600s in Great Britain that also formalized this as a saying. Yeah. But Franklin kind of put it into American lore as
this. I grew up hearing it, and I have even in I've seen it play out in different conversations with folks. You'll occasionally hear somebody be like, well, God helps those that help themselves, and usually it gets spoken about in a phrase of, well, I'm going to do something. I'm starting a business, or I'm going to be a type A. I'm a type A person, or I'm a go-getter, and I just really believe God helps those that help themselves. And I'm like, well, which God are you talking about? Because
that's always the first.
That's always the first question, right? Yeah. So it's to sit here and to think about it, it's like, okay, well, I think we should be able to address this because. If you don't hold to this belief, there's a good chance that someone who is a Christian believes this.
Yes.
And so it's like, oh, okay, yeah. So Mike, where do you think people get this concept? Even where do they pull it from in the Bible, or is it just one of those topics that somebody's just like, well, I think it's. It's like the little drummer boy must be in one of the Gospels, right? So
I think that there's layers to it.
Sure.
So I think in ancient Greece, that individualism was kind of an important thing. The idea of becoming this greater person and lifting yourself up, and there was a sense of communal pride, pride in your city state in that sense. Yeah. But philosophically, we've got the Stoics from that era. We got people who were really looking at individuals and the glory of man. Yeah. And it was the Greek gods helped those who helped themselves. So this ancient ideal of the gods are watching, and if you're working really hard, they're like, oh, I kind of like that guy. Yeah. So I'm going to help him because he's working really hard.
Yeah.
And you see
he's
that.
doing the right stuff.
Yeah, you can see that in the mythologies, in the Greek mythologies, where gods admire Odysseus. Yeah. Certain gods would admire Odysseus, and they're like, well, we'll help him along. He's working really hard. He's doing a good job. So there's this sense that that the gods are watching and they're impressed by the work that you do. Yeah. And bring that up into Enlightenment throughout history, then your Enlightenment individualistic tendency let's really hold on to the rugged individualism of American mythology. And so there's this strain all the way up through where the individual becomes the end all be all.
Yeah.
Like what I do is most important.
Yeah.
And if there's a God, which then fits into that theological structure of early America was, we think there's a God.
Yeah.
We're not really thinking there's much supernatural going on, but sure. We don't have any other explanations. Yeah. Probably a God in there somewhere.
You're pulling from the kind of the deist the mindset, deist right? Yep. So you got like a Jefferson and some of those guys that were like, we believe that there's God, but we deny the miraculous of it. Right, like he put things in place. And so that subculture.
And Franklin was not like to get up to Ben Franklin's like.
Well, it's not a massive jump.
We'll put this in here in this in the Poor Richard's Almanac because it's a cool saying and it's something that he was always. He put in things that he felt would help humanity. He was more of a humanist than a deist even.
Yeah. It's probably that lightning strike.
Yeah, that did something to him.
I understand why Philadelphia is so messed up to this.
We should do a whole series on American mythology. But so you have this like from the ancient Greek philosophy all the way up through early American deism, the idea of God being separate, but then kind of admiring like, oh, these people are doing something good. And I think in the case of the later deist mindset, it was more of a, well, you need to help yourself no matter what.
Sure.
And that admonition of God helps those who help themselves really has less to do with God and everything to do with me.
Yeah. And I think that as I was trying to think through this, that this doesn't undermine the idea that the Bible does talk about like
working hard,
work ethic. It doesn't. It's not. It's not undermining that.
Yeah.
But it is a. Boy, it can create a mindset that if things aren't working out, that you must be still doing something wrong.
Yeah.
Right. So because it does center in and around God helps the worthy. Like maybe you're not actually worthy because you're not working hard enough.
I think that's a really good point, that it's not just God helping those who help themselves. They are worthy of being helped.
They're worthy of being helped.
Because they're working hard enough.
Yeah, and I think when you get to that, right? And it's a separate conversation about what is a Christian work ethic, what is a God honoring work ethic. I can't even talk. I'm sorry. So, but what is that? Like all of a sudden, you've got to start like pulling apart from. Okay, no, we're supposed to, we have responsibility. We have things that we should be doing, and we should do everything for God's glory. So that means, we should be able to go, I'm doing my best at this. I've given my all to what is there. I've given my capacity, in these places of life. But to then all of a sudden, like, you've got to watch out if that. Again, I think the subtlety of the things we've been talking about in this series is where they go awry.
There's nuance.
There is, yeah. Because if all of a sudden, you go, well, does God want us to be, does God want us to experience blessing, with the prosperity? Does God demand that we're poor? Like you can look at these things and you can go, okay, there's nuance that's there where people grab passages of Scripture and go, and twist it. Yeah. This one's different in a sense because there's not a passage, there's not a scripture for it. But the mindset of it has infiltrated within Christianity so much so that over half. Like, and I don't think that goes away. Like, I don't think that's gone down in 6 years. So what does it look like then to go? Well, how do we identify if that's not true? What is true?
Yeah.
And so that we can then begin to push back against that, because I think that's where we start to get into that's where you start having to confront, am I thinking this way?
Yeah. And I think that, well, let's look at the opposite to examine it a little bit.
Yeah.
perhaps the opposite would be to say, I do nothing and God does everything.
Mm-hmm.
So I just sit back and I just kind of float through life like a Forrest Gump that just kind of goes.
You're a feather just floating around.
Floating around.
I'm the downing feather because of my complexion. I'm so pale.
Yes. You're the soft downy one.
I'm getting older. Leave me alone.
It was softer than I used to be.
Yeah, for sure.
But the opposite of that mentality is I'm just going to sit here and do nothing.
Yeah.
And how many people have you talked to that do that too?
Yeah.
I'm just waiting on God.
I'm just
waiting on God.
Yeah.
And you want to go, you've been waiting for 25 years. And sometimes that's a badge of honor. Like I've just been faithfully doing nothing for 25 years, waiting on God to direct me.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's the right mentality either, because I think that God clearly says, here's what I want you to do.
Yeah.
Go be me.
Yeah.
Go represent me.
Yeah.
Go be like Jesus, wherever you are.
Even the way Paul talks to the church.
Yeah.
Listen, don't mooch off of other people, right? Like, do your day's work.
Yeah.
Take care of those you're responsible for. All of these things. It's like, okay, so the extremes of it, either for it or, as you mentioned, the opposite side of it.
Yeah.
Both of extremes are dangerous. Wow, I never thought about that. But
we should,
man, maybe that should be one.
Man, we should really talk about that.
That's probably in the Bible, though. So, no, all right. So, but you get into that reality of, oh man, people can very quickly place their efforts either for or in waiting on God's responsibility.
Yeah.
Like, and so God all of a sudden becomes. Well, maybe I should think about that before those words come out of my mouth. It either is all about us, or none of it has to do with us. Right. Now, Ephesians,
none of our efforts.
Yeah, none of our efforts, right?
Yeah.
And so I think we have to think through this just a little bit, because maybe there is a distinction in saying, at a spiritual soul level, we do nothing to earn our salvation, right? Ephesians, like, it's by grace you're saved. Through faith, it's not works, so that you can't boast, right?
Yep.
So, okay, great. But then you look at the way that Jesus talks about just even our daily existence, like not worrying about it, but trusting that God's going to provide the means and the peace for it. And so do we make a distinction in the statement of our soul and our spiritual care and the tangible nature of, like, if you're going like your hierarchy of needs, if you're going to jump into Maslow, like, right, oh well, we need we need shelter and this and all those
security, shelter, and self-actualization.
We're working our way up, right? So do we or should we think in a dichotomy? I guess that maybe that's the question that is. I'm thinking out loud with you here.
Yeah, well, I think that if we keep it in that realm of God helping or not helping,
sure.
I think that I go back to Dallas Willard, because most everything goes back to Dallas Willard. Right after the Bible.
Right after Jesus in the Bible.
Yeah, right.
Willard's like your spirit man.
Yeah, but Willard said grace is not opposed to effort, it's opposed to earning.
Yeah.
So the grace that we've been given is free. We don't have to earn it, but if you look at James chapter 2, who says, well, if you tell me you have faith but don't do anything good, then what good is your faith?
Yeah.
It's like, it's kind of this play on words, like he's using those same words. So you have faith, that's great. If it doesn't do anything, then it's a useless thing to have anyway. It's
if it doesn't bear fruit.
Right. And it's like saying, I've got this, got this great motorcycle. Have you ridden it? No, I just love to look at it. And I go and shine it up, and I clean it. I don't do that. You've been riding more than I have.
I was out in 30-degree weather today.
So it's like, I have this thing, and you can't go around saying that you have this thing.
Sure.
So if every time you came into the office, I'm like, I looked at my motorcycle today. I'm like, what good is it, man?
You'd be like, give it to me.
You just you just walked past it. You walk past it every day.
Yeah.
And it's just there.
Yeah.
So that is what our faith is supposed to spur us on to action.
Sure.
And that is how we're supposed to live our life. So the efforts that we make to live our faith are expected. And those are the things that when we look at through the Gospels, through the epistles, it's always, hey, do these things. Like move this direction. This is what it looks like to move forward. This is what it looks like to be shaped in the image of Christ, is to do that. But the strength to do that, the ability to do that, even the desire to do that doesn't come from my own natural desire. It comes from the shaping of the Spirit and the presence of the Spirit.
And so if you consider that we find our being and our ability to do in God, if we find that Christ holds all things together, and has put things there, like what is the idea, the concept of God's help look like?
That's a good. I was thinking about that when you were talking before. What is the role of God then in this whole scenario? And I was going to ask you that.
No, I asked first. Yes, I'm going to make Mike do his job. Like what is God's help, right? I guess in the phrase, if we're sticking with the original phrase, God helps those that help themselves, right? I think it has to do more about the perception of, I was going to say blessing, but that doesn't answer it, right? Abundance or
success,
provision, or so if it's God helps those that help themselves, at a concept of like, okay, maybe I'm a farmer in an agrarian society. I'm going out and I'm doing all the hard work in the fields. I'm plowing. I'm, spreading manure for fertilizer. I'm doing all the stuff that's there. God's going to honor my efforts. And I'm going to have a crop at the end, right?
Which, if that's the case, it's not a big jump to the prosperity gospel.
Sure. Yeah. And so if you look at it from that standpoint, or maybe you are an investor, and so you take the little bit of resources you have, you invest it in the right places, you see a return on your investment, right? You're getting God, like the concept of like, maybe God's help is seen in that way of, I'm putting in the effort, I'm doing this stuff, I'm not giving up, look, I've got a return on my time and work and effort. Again, and you bringing up the prosperity gospel, it's not a far jump to that. You're right, because we know several people and have known people who were farmers that put the time and the effort and churn and do all the work, and then there's a drought, or then there's too much rain, right? And so it's like, wait, is that God going? Like,
you didn't do enough.
You didn't do enough. You should have you should have built big barns that have retractable roofs over top of them, or like, you know what I mean? It becomes all of a sudden, whether like I think it turns into this idea that we experienced in some of the foreign countries, that all of a sudden when bad things happen, the spiritual awareness throughout some of those communities you've done something wrong. God's judging you for this. The gods are judging you for this, not God, but the gods are doing this. And you look at some of the ancient communities where the way that they viewed their gods were violent, unpredictable, because they tied it to the natural ebbs and flows of nature. Resulted in the way people viewed gods. So if you go into some of the areas of the mountainous regions, you tended to have gods that were very unpredictable, very hard to understand, because you could have floods, unpredictable, earthquakes, unpredictable. But then you go to places like Egypt, where there was a rhythm to the flooding of the Nile. They were able to go like, oh, the gods are predictable, more predictable, and they had a very different interaction relationship with their gods, right? And so all of a sudden you get into this mindset that says, like, oh, I'm a farmer, I'm planting all of these things and bad things are happening. Well, God's just unpredictable.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, and all of a sudden we start attributing the unpredictability of life to God. Mm-hmm. I think that is, I have no idea where I was going, Michael. I think that's the challenge of it, right? When you get into this idea of how do we view God?
Yeah.
What does it mean for God to help us?
What's the role of God in all of this? Is he just this unpredictable thing, or is he controllable?
Yeah.
And that, I think...
Can we manipulate God to give us what we want?
Yep.
Right?
Yep. And I think that's where it comes... It's not implicitly stated in God helps those who help themselves. Mm-hmm. It's not implicitly stated you can manipulate God to make you successful.
Sure.
But I think, like we said a few minutes ago, it's not a far jump to the prosperity gospel, which does say you can manipulate God to make you successful.
Yeah.
So the idea of, as long as I'm working hard, God will help me be successful.
Yeah.
And then what happens if you work hard and aren't successful?
Yeah.
Does that mean God wasn't helping? Does that mean that God, you didn't do enough? You weren't working hard enough?
Yeah.
I think if we can get away from this concept overall, that God somehow sees what we're doing in some way and decides that based on our efforts, he's going to bless someone.
Yeah.
And I think that when you think about how counter, like, Old Testament concepts are to what that is, and how God revealed himself, it's like, no, I've told you these things to do. Like, he's talking to Israel. I've told you these things to do.
Yeah.
Take care of foreigners. Don't oppress people.
Yeah.
Use your wealth and your power to help those who are.
They were to be a kingdom of priests.
Right.
Right.
So
to take to bring God to the masses.
Yeah.
Right.
To represent God at
Yeah.
a national scale.
Yeah.
But then you will see those sentiments of God causes rain to fall on the just and the unjust.
Yeah.
You know, there's that in Ecclesiastes, in Proverbs, both of those places, there's a lot of different sentiments that are basically going, I don't understand why good people suffer and why bad people seem to thrive.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the conclusion just has to be, maybe God doesn't cause either of those things to happen.
Yeah.
Maybe being faithful to God is what's more important.
Yeah, and that's where I think that's where I think the crux of this is, right? Because we still put in effort, we still do the things that we do because God has given us life and breath. It's like, okay, so we live in light of who he is, and we do the best that we can, and we respond to whatever comes our way.
Yeah.
We respond in faithfulness to God no matter what. And that, I think, is such an important mindset to go into life, not the idea of, well, I just didn't work hard enough for this, right? Because when you come back to the spiritual foundation of this all, right, it really does lean into, we are helpless before God.
Yeah.
Like, you know, and so a mindset of self-sufficiency will undermine. Like if we are self-sufficient spiritually, if we are self-sufficient in the way we go about our days, and then just expect God to go, oh, look what you've done, I'm going to give you more. Then we're putting ourselves and our minds and our souls in a risky position, I would say, in a precarious position.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden it does turn into, what do we do? What have we done? Not what has God done, and how do we live in light of that? And it's a semantic, but semantics matter when they shape the way we approach God.
Yeah.
Right? Because it also, at a spiritual level, it distorts the gospel. It distorts this idea that, okay, well, did Jesus only come for the people that had actually earned it? Right? That's the complete opposite of what we see. And so I think it turns into, for me at least, I really have embraced that, my faith and what I do for career or in projects I'm working on outside of work, but just family thing. Like, they are all intertwined. And if I make a distinction between spiritual realities and physical realities, I'm putting myself in a place where I don't have to worry about God.
Yeah.
And I think that's
we
the risk of it.
compartmentalize those things. And I now there is a spiritual dimension.
Sure.
And I think that when we confuse the two, that's where some of the sentiment gets confused.
Yeah.
I'm thinking specifically of the parable of the wealthy, or the leader who went away and gave his servants like 10 minas,
sure, yeah,
5 minas, and one,
yeah,
and he comes back and he's like,
and he doubled it,
yeah, like, hey, you get 10 cities then, because he was going away, being made a king. Now you had 10 minas, you got me 10 more. Now you get 10 cities, and but when Jesus was telling these parables, he would say the kingdom of God is like, and so I think that if we're taking those parables and those concepts and placing them in this physical reality now, like, oh, if you're faithful to God, then He's going to give you more responsibility here and now.
Yeah.
Or He's going to bless you, or whatever. I'm not really on board with that. Like, I do kind of see the parallel between if you're able to consistently be faithful with what you have now, then maybe God will open up more opportunity for you to serve in different ways and bigger ways. But I'm hesitant to say that I'm hesitant to take a parable where God says the kingdom of God is like this, and turn that into the kingdom of Mike.
Like well, I like the way that you phrased it. Like if it becomes about the kingdom of me, right? I think when you look at those parables, we have to be we have to consider, like, you can take something from a parable and then like pull it out of a context to make it say what you want it to say. But if you can do that with other things. So if you look at it from the standpoint of, okay, the person that gave the money or the property to say, hey, I'll be back. Right. Well, what's the timeline for that? What's the timeline for God's faithfulness, for God's, God's blessing of those who were faithful? And then you get to the guy that was like, oh, well, I knew you were harsh and I didn't want to upset you, so I buried it. Right. Well, the point isn't necessarily about the blessings for the first two, as much as it is also about the guy that was like, the guy had resources given to him by the master, and he just buried it. And the master comes back and is like, hey, why did you bury? If you're so afraid, why didn't you at least put it in the bank?
Could have gained interest.
You gain interest, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, you would have had something to show for it. Instead, you had nothing to show for it. And so you have to come back to that and go like, okay, so if I'm saying, well, God helps them to help themselves, and I'm basing it on a parable, you have to consider all of the parable.
Right.
And what's the point? It's like, okay, well, people are using what God has given them. There's a variety of people that start with a lot of different resources, and then there's people that may start with less, but the point is not what they start with. The point is what they do with it.
Right? And there's no guarantee of success. And I think overall the point of that is what you do here echoes into eternity. So what you do with the resources that you've been given, that echoes into what it looks like, what eternity looks like, and the responsibility that you're given by God in eternity. The role that you play in His eternal kingdom. So I think that there's this marrying of the two, but if we just separate, no, this is all the physical reality of our lives right now. All of the effort that I'm putting in, God has to honor that, and God has to like say He's going to help me out with this effort because I'm doing it for Him, and I'm being faithful. And we both know multiple people who are very faithful and work really, really hard in countries that where they will never be successful. They will never be secure. Physically secure, financially secure. It's
with their own lives.
With their own lives. Like, does God help those who help themselves only apply to American Christianity? And I feel like that is what so many of these come down to. is we've accepted these terms or this way of viewing God, this way of viewing spirituality and in faith, and wrapped it in an American Christian context, and it feels good in this context. But to go over to Burma and tell somebody that God helps those who help themselves, and this pastor just took a week to get there to do this class, and then he's going to take another week to get home because he has to walk half the way, and then he's going to go back to this village that was possibly, like, they're always concerned about being on the run. And he's going to say, God helps those who help themselves. And, like, that's ridiculous. There's no way that works in that context.
I think there's another element in there that, as you were describing that, I was like, well, does that mean that the ends justify the means? Right? There's another element. As you were describing that, God helps those that help themselves. So does that mean, like, you know, and I think the bigger key there is what you said. Do these things, do they make us feel better? Do they work in another country? Do they work in another context? Do they work in another community? And the amount of times that you watch folks that will go, they will do unethical things because they believe that in the long run it will be better. Right? And so is that helping yourself? And I think we have to draw a line in what has Christ called us, who has he called us to be? How has he called us to live our lives? And now I get we don't live perfectly. I get that we all fall short, right? But how do we lean into the consistent character of Christ and a consistent ethic for life? Without making a presumption that what we want for ourselves, God will somehow, if we get the combination right, God's gonna open that up for us. Is it about the kingdom of God, or is it about the kingdom of Mike? Is it about the kingdom of God, or is it about the kingdom of Scott? Is it right? And that's a day-to-day. Like
the question is every day. What am I doing this for? What are my efforts actually for?
And I think when you read through the stories of Scripture, you see God helps the helpless. Right? And so whether that's ancient Israel or pre-ancient Israel or the early church or Jesus in his ministry in and among the people or the church throughout Acts, like it was not the power and influence of the person that moved God on their behalf. It was, in many ways, it's the acknowledgement of their helplessness before him.
You know, I think that is a perfect, succinct antidote to God, the opposite. God helps those who help themselves is not true. That's made up. God helps the helpless is fully biblical. And that's, you're right. You can trace that concept all through from the garden of a pile of dust that God breathes life into and makes the Adam. Like the word Adam means dustling. It could be translated dustling or the one of the dust. It's not a beautiful name. It's like dirt that came to life. That's what Adam means. And that, so the epitome of helplessness at the very beginning, and then all the way through, you see Noah as just trying to get by. You see Abraham as living with his father-in-law, like not really doing anything. And God says, "Hey, follow me. Pack it all up. I'm going to take you to a place that you don't even know about yet." Israel Jacob was this guy that had, like, he was a schemer. He was always trying to manipulate his way. He had nothing. He was on the run. All the way up through. Israel's in captivity. You know, they had nothing. They were slaves. You just see all of this Old Testament as everyone was helpless, and as soon as they thought they were good, as soon as they thought they were the ones that made it happen, that's when they died. That's
when they had main character vibes, it seems like things went awry. And a lot of those stories, you see people hustling for like their own good, and it's almost like God works in spite of it.
Yeah.
Not to spite them, but in spite of all of their own efforts.
Yeah.
God still like actually was working for their good.
Yeah.
And so it's not God working because of their efforts. It's God helping people that were unable to help themselves.
Yeah. So is that still a New Testament concept?
What's that?
That God helping the helpless. Where do you see that? We talked about Old Testament and looking at that, but can we see that as a post-Christ?
I think it's fairly clear at a spiritual context, right? I think it's very clear in salvation by grace through faith, right? That's not it's not our own efforts to do it. I think you see there's a couple of passages that I think I scribbled a couple down that I thought through. But 2 Corinthians is 12. It says that my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Yep. So like our true strength comes from our reliance on God, right? Like it comes out of our weakness and not being the self-sufficient one that is that's getting stuff done. It's Romans 5, while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. Again, it's not us in our strength getting things done. Yeah. And this is where I think some of the questions about, do you make the distinction between our spirit and the physical pieces of it, right? But those are a couple of them.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, so I think New Testament, I think you see the concept continually through there, that but it's rooted in more than just the tangible physical natures of life. It is rooted in a spiritual reality that says we're more than just what we can get done. We are people who God has set his affection on and has called and redeemed and given purpose and life to. And so we don't have purpose in life for the sake of like building our own, accumulating more and more blessing. We have been given a purpose to become channels for God's blessing to other people. That's not contingent on the resources we have. That's not contingent on the time we have. Like we are conduits of God's blessing, not the person that's just trying to have a storehold of it.
And I think that's a really, really important distinction that you just said, that our efforts are not for our own ends, not for our own benefit. Our efforts are for the good of others. So, God, it's almost subversive in how to think about it, that God blesses our efforts when we are focused on others, because then we become the conduit through which God blesses others. But if we're thinking that God will bless us, God will bless me because my effort for myself is so strong that God sees how great it is and will bless me. Like that's if you deconstruct that term, God
that should be troubling just right off the bat.
Right. And you really look at it and go, oh, that's really about me and God blessing me and making me successful. Well, my goodness, there's nothing like that's all pride. That's all self-centeredness. It's all selfishness. There's really nothing in that whole phrase that is accurate to the gospel. So God will bless others through me as I put forth effort to follow Christ and to be like Christ. That's more accurate.
I think that probably is a real key to going to growing in discernment. When you hear something that you're like, well, that's been something I've grown up hearing in the church. Ask the question, does this fit within my understanding of the gospel, of my helplessness and God's provision for the sake of loving the whole world and wanting all to come to know him, right? Does that fit within the context? And I'd say the second is, does this apply to other people in different cultures and communities around the world, right? And so if you live with blinders on and don't look at community. We have a family here at the church that they're refugees from the Congo, and week before last, 70 Christians were found murdered in a church. So, were they not helping themselves?
Yeah,
right.
Not putting enough
Does the
effort
context work?
Yeah.
For other people in other circumstances. And I think if we can look at it in those two ways, is this in alignment with the gospel? Is this alignment with the truth of who God is and what He has called His people to be?
Yeah.
Great. If it doesn't, then red flag. Right?
Yeah.
And does this work for someone in a context different than what we experience with financial stability and blessing? One of the things I've been talking about with my kids lately, with everything going on in the world and increased prices on stuff, and like even just when we sit at night for prayer, it becomes, Lord, like, how do we express gratitude for what we have?
Yeah.
Because I want my kids to know deeply inside, and I have to remind myself that the stability that I have is not normal.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not for the vast majority of the world if you go by population numbers. I don't, even when things are tight and chaotic, there is this sense of, I don't have to worry if I'm going to be able to put food in my belly.
Yeah. And most of the world doesn't feel that.
Doesn't
way.
have that experience. That is different. And my kids don't have to worry about, will I have shoes that will fit on my feet and clothes when I go to school, or will I like my son, despite my best efforts to get him to wear a coat when it's so cold, is like, I'm not outside, Dad. I'm literally, I walk from the house to the bus to the school, and I'm indoors all day. I go from the school to the bus, and then to wrestling practice, and then I go from wrestling practice to the car. I don't need a coat. And I'm like, first world problems.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, because there's a whole lot of people in the world who would love a coat.
Yeah. Even in my own country, there's people that would love a coat.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it is, does this term, or does this like thing that people accept as in the Bible, does it actually apply to people that don't have your experience?
Yeah, I think that's a good measure across the board. If the gospel only applies in your context, is it really the gospel? And I think that we should think about that. We should think about that when we come across, when we throw out these cliches or these Christian epithets that are just meant to be an easy answer or make us feel better. Ask if you told somebody in a third world country the same thing, would that mean anything? To me, most of the time, it's the same as saying, be warm and well fed and going on your way, and not recognizing that they're not warm and they're not well fed. And your efforts should be to feed them and get them clothes, not to give these sentiments that make you feel better. And so to wrap up, it's not scriptural to say that God helps themselves.
God helps
those who help them. God helps himself to more mashed potatoes.
What? I don't know what that means, Michael.
I don't either.
That's not in the Bible.
God helps those who help themselves is a self-centered, cultural-centric way of thinking about God's role in your personal life. God helps the helpless. That's scriptural. God calls us as his representatives to help the helpless. That's scriptural. The efforts that we put into helping those who are in need, God blesses those efforts through us to bless other people. That's scriptural. But God helping those who help themselves is not in the Bible.
Doesn't have a place.
Shouldn't have a place in our walk of faith either.
That's good.
Yeah, that's a good place to
to
summarize and wrap up here.
Yes, it is.
Thanks for joining us again. Hopefully this debunking of a Christian myth did not throw you too much.
Yeah.
I trust that if you have any comments or any questions, that you'll be able to ask them. You can do that on our YouTube channel. You can do that by logging in or going to discoverthegrove.com.
Yep.
Sending us what is it? Information.
Info
at discoverthegrove.com.
Yeah.
You can send us an email there, ask questions, make suggestions. Until next week, we hope you have a great week and that you are warm and well fed. And if you're not, or you see somebody who's not, please make the effort to take care of them.
Yeah, sounds good, man.
Yeah.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.